Hi, everyone. So I'm Madeline with the Idaho Federation of Families, and I'm here with Kayla Steinmann, who works at Disability Rights Idaho in the youth unit. And today we are going to be discussing minors and consent to sexual activity. We are going to be talking about the legal considerations that minors should be aware of regarding consent to sexual activity. And a couple of things that we are specifically going to go into today are what is consent, what is sexual assault, the age of consent in Idaho, and what minors should be aware of when it comes to sexting. So to start things off, I am going to ask Kayla, what is consent?
So, if you give consent for something to happen, that means you're giving permission for that thing to happen. As it relates to sexual activity, consent in Idaho is not actually legally defined. Does this mean that consent doesn't exist in Idaho? No. Consent in terms of sexual activity is an expressed and communicated willingness between two people to agree to a specific sexual activity. Consent is all about communicating boundaries, and consenting to one activity is not consent to all activities. The acronym to remember here is FRIES. FRIES means consent is freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. Freely given means the freedom to say yes or no. This means that there's no pressure to do something or no force or manipulation when it comes to sexual activity. Reversible means you can take consent back always and at any time, even in the middle of an action. You can say stop or no, or I don't want to do this anymore, and the other person no longer has consent and must respect your boundaries. Informed means that both parties know exactly what they are consenting to every single time. Enthusiastic means both parties are excited and interested in what they are consenting to. And specific means that both parties are consenting to a specific activity. And remember that consenting to one activity does not mean that a person has consented to another activity. Consenting to kissing is not the same thing as consenting to sex. And consent is everyone's responsibility. What I mean by this is that not only should you be verbally communicating your consent to the other person, verbally communicating your boundaries, but it's important that you make sure that they are verbally communicating their consent to you. It is important to speak up for your boundaries, but if they aren't speaking up for theirs and you proceed without a verbal and enthusiastic yes, you could be proceeding without their consent and committing a crime.
Thank you for that. I think all those components are really important. There's a lot when it comes to consent and a lot to consider. So I think the FRIES acronym just lays it out really clearly, and I'm glad that we have that as a tool now. So my next question is, now that we've talked a little bit about what the idea of consent is and what it should look like, what is not consent? So what is sexual assault?
A person is sexually assaulted when anyone, including a stranger, acquaintance, date, spouse, or family member, engages in any type of sexual activity with that person without his or her consent. Assault may involve the use of physical force, emotional coercion, threats, or manipulation. So someone has committed sexual assault if they proceed with a sexual act without your consent. And it's important to note that sexual assault is not always violent. It can be, but it's not always.
So I think that's really important because I think in a lot of media portraits and ways in which they show sexual assault in the media is that it's a stranger and in an unfamiliar place, but majority of the time it is with someone that the victim or survivor knows or trusts. So I think it's really important that you mentioned all those different examples. Thank you. My next question is silence considered consent?
No, silence is not verbally communicated. Idaho law acknowledges that there are situations where the victim won't be fighting and screaming no. And just because they aren't doing this doesn't mean that the perpetrator has the victim's consent. Silence does not mean consent. Furthermore, alcohol affects an individual's ability to consent. If the victim was drunk and was not aware, knowing, perceiving, or cognizant that the act occurred, and that is exact language from the Idaho statute, that is still sexual assault. If someone is too drunk to even speak, that they aren't going to be able to say no, that is not consent. If someone is so drunk that they are passed out, they are not able to give consent. This is why it is important to communicate consent and to have consent communicated back to you when engaging in sexual activity, because the absence of hearing the word no is not always consent, and the law has provisions that allow someone to be guilty of sexual assault without the victim saying the words no. If someone is too drunk to consent and is even saying yes, that could still be sexual assault if they were so drunk that they were not aware of what was happening or what they were consenting to. Something to consider too is that the consent is not a defense to statutory rape, which is when the victim has not reached the age of consent.
Thank you for explaining that. I think that that can be really tricky sometimes, and not everyone knows that silence is not consent, that it's not the same thing as consent. And I also appreciate what you brought up about being intoxicated and consent as well. So my next question, because you brought it up a little bit at the end, relates to statutory rape. So what is the age of consent and how does that relate to statutory rape?
In Idaho, the age of consent is 18. This is when an individual may legally consent to sex. If an individual cannot legally consent to sex and they have sex, that means that they have had sex without consent, which we just discussed is sexual assault. This is why it's called statutory rape, because it doesn't matter if the other person who is under the age of 18 is willingly giving consent. By statute, we have defined that anything below 18, they are not able to give consent, and therefore sexual activity is sexual assault, except in these couple of situations that I'm going to describe. So in Idaho, if an individual is 16 or 17 years old, they may consent to sex, but only if the person they are consenting to sex with is less than 3 years older than them. So, for example, if a 16-and-a-half-year-old has sex with a 19-year-old, that is not statutory rape because 19 years old is less than 3 years older. But you do have to count those 3 years exactly. You have to count the months exactly. If a 17-year-old has sex with a 21-year-old, that is statutory rape, and the 21-year-old can be charged and convicted of statutory rape. When an individual is 18, they may legally consent to sex, but remember, you don't ever have to consent to sex with anyone else over the age of 18. It is important to note that under Idaho law, you may not legally consent to sex at 15. If it's the day before your 16th birthday and you have sex with someone who is 16 years old, that means that you're still 15, they're 16, that 16-year-old could be charged with statutory rape.
So I just want to make sure I'm clear on this. 16 and 17-year-olds may consent to sex with someone less than 3 years older than them, but 15-year-olds may not consent to sex. Is that correct?
Under Idaho law, yes.
So what are some other legal things that teens should be aware of when it comes to sex? What should they be aware of when it comes to sexting?
So in Idaho, as well as every other state, possession and distribution of child pornography is illegal. So if you are under 18, you're a minor and a child under our laws. And that means that if you are sending, requesting, or sharing nude photos of yourself, a minor, you may face child pornography distribution charges. This also means that the person receiving those photos may also be charged with possession of child pornography. It is super healthy and normal to want or to have a romantic connection as a teenager. However, there are ways to be romantically involved without posing a potential lifelong risk to yourself or to others. Just know that sexting is sexual activity, and you should be giving consent in the same way that you are for any sexual activity. And this means that you should never feel pressured to send a photo. No one should ever be making you do something that you don't want to do. Know that when you or someone else takes a photo and sends it, that photo is never technically deleted. And Once it's out of your possession and control, it can end up anywhere.
That's really scary. And I'm glad that you were able to clarify some of those laws and definitions for us. So now that we've discussed all of this, I just want everyone to know that if you or someone else that you know has been sexually assaulted, please seek professional care and mental health treatment and consider telling a trusted adult. The National Sexual Assault Hotline is also a great resource. They're able to answer questions and give advice to people anonymously. You can reach them at 1-800-656-4673, and we will have that information on the next slide and also in the little information box below the video. So I feel like this was a great conversation, and we're really excited to continue with more conversations with Kayla in the future. So thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks so much for all the info, Kayla.
All right, have a good day. Bye.
You too. Bye.